They laughed at the widow for piling wood around the house until winter came, and Margaret Bennet wiped the tears from her face as she carried another armful of wood toward her small wooden house. The neighbors in the village of St. Benedict Heights had stopped greeting her weeks ago, and the malicious whispers reached her ears like silent stab wounds. Since she had been widowed 8 months ago, she hadn't spent a single day without stacking more logs around her modest home. It was as if an invisible force compelled her to continue this task that in the eyes of others seemed the definitive sign that loneliness had consumed her sanity. "Look at the wood lady," commented Jennifer, the bakery owner, pointing discreetly through the window. Poor thing lost her mind after Harold passed. Beside her, Robert, the local shopkeeper, shook his head with disdain. "It's a shame to see a woman her age working herself to death carrying wood. She should be in a retirement home, not putting on this whole show." Margaret knew they talked about her. She knew her every move was watched and judged by the small community that had once respected her as a retired teacher. But something stronger than shame pushed her to continue. A promise whispered in her husband's last moments of lucidity, words only she had heard. The truth was that Harold Bennet hadn't been just the local school janitor as everyone thought. During 42 years of marriage, Margaret had kept the secret he himself had asked her to maintain. Her husband was a self-taught meteorologist who had studied the weather patterns of the Appalachian mountain region with a precision that would impress any expert. On cold winter nights when the neighbors slept, Harold stayed up until the early hours noting temperatures, measuring humidity, and observing cloud formations through a telescope he had built with his own hands. Margaret helped by organizing data and transcribing observations he made in a nearly illegible handwriting. "Margaret, my love," he had said the last time he managed to speak clearly, "this year will be different. The notes, they're all in the chest in the bedroom. The winter, it will be terrible." She hadn't fully understood at the time. She was too devastated by the prospect of losing him to process the meaning of his words. Only when she found the notebooks months later did she understand the urgency in his voice. Harold had predicted that the winter of 2024 would be the harshest the region had ever faced. His notes showed a weather pattern that repeated every 73 years, and all evidence pointed to temperatures that could reach 15 degrees below zero, something never seen in St. Benedict Heights. With each passing day of stacking wood, Margaret felt the weight of disapproving stares, but she also felt a growing certainty that she was doing the right thing. The signs her husband had described in his forecasts were happening exactly as he predicted. The autumn had been drier than normal, certain bird species had migrated 2 weeks earlier than usual, and the trees were losing leaves in a strange pattern. "You shouldn't be carrying heavy things," said Dr. William, the village doctor, stopping his car beside her one morning. "At your age, these activities can cause serious problems." Margaret stopped and looked at him with dignity. "Doctor, I'm 65, not 90. I still have the strength to take care of myself. But this excessive stockpiling of wood," he hesitated, choosing his words. "People are worried. Perhaps it would be better to talk to someone, a psychologist. People talk too much and understand too little," Margaret replied curtly, adjusting the brown shawl over her shoulders. "If you'll excuse me, I have work to do, Doctor." William watched as she walked away carrying more logs. Truth be told, he was also worried, but for reasons different from the other residents. Margaret had always been one of the most sensible women in the community. If she was behaving so differently, perhaps there was a reason the others couldn't see. That same afternoon, Derek, the eldest son of the Thompson family, who had inherited his father's hardware store, made a decision that would completely change the course of events. Annoyed by the constant comments about the crazy wood lady, he decided to take practical action to, in his words, protect the community. "Mrs. Margaret," he said when she entered the store looking for a new axe blade, "I can't sell this to you." Margaret stared at him, not understanding. "What do you mean, is my money no good?" "It's not that." Derek scratched his head, uncomfortable but determined. "It's that you're hurting yourself with these tools. Just look at your hands." Indeed, Margaret's hands were marked by small cuts and calluses. Months of carrying and chopping wood had taken their toll. "These are the marks of honest work," she said firmly. "Now sell me that blade." A woman your age shouldn't be playing with dangerous tools, insisted Derek, crossing his arms. It's my responsibility not to contribute to you getting hurt any further. Margaret's blood boiled. 40 years teaching children and teenagers, treating each one with respect and patience, and now a young man who was still in diapers when she was already teaching dared to dictate what she could or couldn't do. You have no right to decide this for me, she said, trying to keep her voice controlled. In my store I do, replied Derek. In fact, I'll advise the other merchants in the area to do the same. It's for your own safety. Margaret left the store empty-handed, but with renewed determination. If they wanted to make her preparations difficult, she would find other ways. At home, she took the old rusty axe that had belonged to her husband. The blade was dull and the handle wobbled, but it would have to do. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. The following days were even harder. Margaret constantly cut herself trying to chop wood with the inadequate tool, but she refused to give up. Every morning, she woke before sunrise and began her work, ignoring the back pain and the malicious whispers of the neighbors. It's a pointless stubbornness, commented Mrs. Betty, a 72-year-old retiree who lived 3 houses down. In my day, a widowed woman knew how to behave. At least she's not bothering anyone, retorted Susan, the nurse from the local health clinic. Leave the woman alone. Susan was one of the few people who still treated Margaret with the respect she had always deserved. At 45, she had arrived in the village only 2 years ago, but had quickly become a respected figure for her competence and dedication to her work. Mrs. Margaret has always been an intelligent person, continued Susan. If she's doing this, she must have her reasons. Crazy reasons, grumbled Betty. Lost her husband and lost her mind along with him. These conversations reached Margaret's ears through Dorothy, her only true friend in the village. Dorothy had been Margaret's colleague at the school, and even retired, kept in regular contact with her. Don't pay any mind to those gossiping tongues, Dorothy would say during her weekly visits. You've always been smarter than all that riffraff put together. It's not a matter of being smart, Dorothy, sighed Margaret, massaging her injured hands. It's a matter of doing what needs to be done. But explain something to me, insisted Dorothy. Why so much firewood? Are you afraid of winter? Margaret hesitated. Dorothy had been her friend for over 20 years, but the secret Harold had kept was too heavy to share without absolute certainty. What if she was wrong? What if her husband's predictions were just the delusions of a sick man? Harold always said this winter would be different, she finally said, choosing her words carefully. He understood these things. Dorothy arched her eyebrows. Harold had always seemed like a simple, hard-working man to her, but without any special knowledge. What do you mean he understood? He was the school custodian. He was more than that, murmured Margaret. Much more. But she said nothing else, and Dorothy respected her silence. March arrived with temperatures lower than normal. Meteorologists from the capital spoke of a climate anomaly and an atypical cold front, but nothing that indicated special concern. Life in the village continued at its usual pace, except for the increasingly sharp comments about Margaret's strange behavior. The situation reached a breaking point when Derek began influencing other merchants. The pharmacy stopped selling ointment for her bruised hands. The gas station refused to sell kerosene for her lamps. It was as if the community had decided to force her to abandon what they considered a dangerous obsession. This is persecution, Margaret vented to Susan during a routine medical checkup. They're trying to stop me from preparing. Preparing for what, Mrs. Margaret? Asked Susan gently. Can you explain it to me? Margaret studied the nurse's face. There was sincerity in her eyes, not the judgment she found in others. Susan, would you believe me if I said I know things about this winter that no one else knows? It depends, Susan replied honestly. What kind of things? Margaret took a deep breath. It was a risk, but she needed at least one person who understood her. My husband studied the climate of the region for over 40 years. He predicted that this winter will be the worst of our lives. Susan remained silent for a long moment. Harold studied the weather? How so? In his spare time, he recorded temperatures, observed wind patterns, noted animal behaviors. He discovered a cycle that repeats every 73 years, and this is the year. "Do you have those notes?" asked Susan, genuinely interested. Margaret nodded. Boxes and boxes of them. Charts, tables, predictions, all handwritten, all very detailed. Why didn't he share this with anyone? "Because no one would take it seriously," said Margaret bitterly. "A school custodian making weather predictions? They'd laugh at him like they're laughing at me now." Susan grew thoughtful. As a healthcare professional, she was used to assessing when people were telling the truth or delusional. Margaret seemed completely lucid, just tired and frustrated. "Would you let me see those notes?" she finally asked. Margaret felt a wave of relief. Finally, someone was willing to listen to her. "Of course, you can come to my house this afternoon if you like." That afternoon, Susan arrived at Margaret's house carrying a thermos of hot tea. The property was unrecognizable. What was once a simple, tidy garden now looked like a lumberyard. Piles and piles of cut and organized firewood surrounded the house on all sides. "My goodness," murmured Susan, "you really have prepared for a war." "For a battle," corrected Margaret, opening the door. "A battle against the cold." Inside the house, Susan was impressed by the organization. Margaret had turned the living room into a kind of makeshift office, with boxes of carefully labeled papers and charts taped to the walls. "These are Harold's notes," said Margaret, opening one of the boxes. 42 years of weather observations. Susan picked up one of the notebooks and began to leaf through it. The handwriting was difficult, but the data was impressively detailed. Temperatures recorded 3 times a day, wind direction, relative humidity, estimated atmospheric pressure. Everything noted with scientific precision. "This is incredible," murmured Susan. "He was really doing scientific work." "And very good work," said Margaret with pride. "Look here." She showed a graph where Harold had accurately predicted the temperatures of 5 consecutive winters. His forecasts were more precise than those of the official meteorologists. "How did he do this?" "Observation and patterns," explained Margaret. "He said nature always warns when something different is going to happen. We just need to know how to listen." Susan continued examining the notes. In a separate folder, she found the forecasts for the winter of 2024. The numbers were alarming. According to Harold, the region would face temperatures as low as 15 degrees below zero, with severe frosts that would last for weeks. "If this is true," said Susan slowly, "a lot of people are going to suffer." "That's why I'm preparing," said Margaret, "and that's why they think I'm crazy." Susan closed the notebook and looked at Margaret with new respect. "You need to warn people." Margaret laughed bitterly. "Warn them? Susan, they don't even believe I know how to chop firewood properly. Imagine if I start talking about weather forecasts." "Then we're just going to have to wait," said Susan thoughtfully. "And when winter comes, when it comes, it will be too late for those who didn't prepare," Margaret finished. The two women fell silent, contemplating the magnitude of what was to come. April brought the first signs that something was indeed different. The temperature plummeted 15 degrees in a single week, something unprecedented in the region. The plants began to wilt even without frost, and the animals were behaving strangely. Margaret watched everything with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction at seeing her husband's predictions coming true. Sadness at knowing the community that had rejected her was about to face serious difficulties. "People are starting to notice," commented Susan during one of her visits. "Dr. William told me more people are buying medicine for colds and respiratory problems." "It's just the beginning," said Margaret, adjusting her shawl. The same brown shawl she wore every day, made by her own mother decades ago. "The worst hasn't arrived yet." Dorothy appeared that afternoon with news from the village. "Margaret, folks are starting to say you were right about the winter," she said, accepting a cup of hot tea. "Derek from the hardware store mentioned that sales of winter coats have increased a lot. Now they realize," murmured Margaret, "when it's already too late to prepare properly." "Too late how? Winter hasn't even started yet." Margaret showed Harold's graphs to Dorothy. According to the forecasts, May would just be the warm-up. The real cold would begin in June and peak between July and August. "Good heavens," whispered Dorothy, seeing the numbers. 15 below? Is that possible here?" "It happened in 1951, said Margaret, showing another note. "Harold found old records. A lot of people went through hardship back then because no one was prepared." Dorothy left deeply worried. She lived alone in a poorly insulated house with only a small electric heater. If Harold's predictions were right, she was in serious trouble. In the village, the talk about Margaret began to change in tone. Instead of mockery, there was now a growing curiosity about how she had guessed the winter would be more severe. "Maybe she knows something," murmured Robert from the bakery to his wife. "She's always been a studious woman." "Or it could just be luck," replied Jennifer. "1 in 100 attempts gets it right." But when May arrived with temperatures that didn't rise above 8 degrees, even during the day, the community began to get really worried. The health clinic recorded a 50% increase in flu and cold cases. The electricity bills skyrocketed with the excessive use of heaters. Derek from the hardware store noticed a sudden spike in demand for blankets, portable heaters, and thermal insulation. Ironically, many people asked about Firewood, but he didn't carry that product. "We should have a talk with Mrs. Margaret," his wife suggested one night. "She seems to know things." "That crazy woman?" replied Derek, but without his former conviction. "What would she know?" "I don't know, but she was the only one who prepared. She must know something." Derek resisted the idea, but deep down he was beginning to question himself. Margaret had always been respected in the community as an educator. Perhaps her excessive preparation had a more solid basis than he had imagined. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her daily routine of organizing firewood and checking supplies. Susan had become her most frequent visitor, and the two had developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect. "Mrs. Margaret," Susan said one afternoon, "have you ever thought about offering help to people? I mean, in a way they would accept?" Margaret stopped organizing the logs and thought about the question. "How so?" "Well, you have knowledge about how to face extreme cold, right? You could teach people to prepare better." "Susan, they spent months calling me crazy. You think I'm going to give advice now?" "People change their minds when the situation gets tough," Susan said wisely. "And by the looks of it, the situation is going to get very tough." Margaret considered the suggestion. Part of her wanted to see the prejudiced neighbors facing difficulties after being so cruel. But another part, the teacher who had dedicated her life to helping others, wrestled with her conscience. "If they ask for help," she finally said, "in a respectful way, I might consider it." "And if someone asks on their behalf," insisted Susan, "someone who has always respected you?" Margaret looked at the nurse with growing affection. Susan was clearly offering to be the mediator between her and the community. "It depends on who asks, and how they ask." Susan smiled. It was a start. That same night, Susan sought out Dr. William at his private clinic. "Doctor, I need to talk about Mrs. Margaret," she said without preamble. "Ah, yes, the patient obsessed with firewood," replied Dr. William, putting away some files. "How is she?" "She's doing very well. In fact, doctor, she might be right about the winter." Susan told the doctor about Harold's notes and the alarming forecasts. Dr. William, a man of science, was intrigued. Amateur meteorology, interesting. But even if he had some knowledge, how can we know if it's reliable? "He got the forecasts for the last 5 years right, with impressive accuracy," said Susan. "More than the official meteorologists." Dr. William reflected on this. As a doctor, he saw daily the effects of weather on people's health. If the winter was truly as severe as Margaret predicted, the situation could be serious for many residents. "What do you suggest we do?" he asked. "That we talk to her, respectfully, and that we see those notes with our own eyes." Dr. William agreed. The next day, the two sought out Margaret at her home. "Mrs. Margaret," said Dr. William, removing his hat at the entrance, "I would like to apologize for the way I spoke to you weeks ago. It was not appropriate to question your decisions in that manner." Margaret was surprised. It was the first time in months that someone from the community had addressed her with respect. "Thank you, doctor. Please come in." "Inside the house, doctor." William examined Harold's notes with a clinical eye. As a man of science, he immediately recognized the quality and precision of the data. "This is the work of a true researcher," he murmured, impressed. "Did your husband have training in meteorology?" He was self-taught, said Margaret with pride, but he studied more than many professionals. And these forecasts for this year, they're based on 73 years of observation and weather patterns, explained Margaret. Harold discovered there is a cycle that repeats, and the time has come again. Dr. William studied the charts in detail. The numbers were truly alarming. If they were correct, the region would face temperatures that could cause serious health problems, especially for the elderly and children. "Mrs. Margaret," he said finally, "would you be willing to share this information with other people in the community?" Margaret hesitated. "Doctor, these people spent months humiliating me. They called me crazy. They prevented me from buying supplies, and why should I help them now?" "Because you are better than them," said Susan softly, "and because many people could suffer if they don't know what's coming." Dr. William agreed. "Besides, Mrs. Margaret, helping the community would be a way to honor your husband's memory. His work could save lives." The mention of Harold touched Margaret deeply. Yes, her husband would have wanted her to use his knowledge to help others. That's what he would have done. "All right," she said after a long silence. "But with conditions." "Which ones?" "First, I want sincere apologies from those who offended me. Second, I want them to publicly recognize Harold's work. And third, anyone who receives my help must commit to helping others too." Dr. William and Susan exchanged glances. The conditions were fair. "We'll organize it," said Dr. William. "You can leave it to us. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. From that day on, Dr. William and Susan began a discreet campaign to change the community's perception of Margaret. They spoke individually with several families, showing data about average temperatures and warning of the possibility of a harsher winter. "I'm not saying you should believe blindly," Dr. William explained, "but I am saying you should prepare. It doesn't hurt to have extra firewood and more blankets." Dorothy also did her part, talking with her friends from church and the sewing group. "Margaret has always been a sensible woman," she said. "If she's preparing like this, she must know something." Gradually, public opinion began to change. People noticed that Margaret really seemed to know what she was doing. Her house was always warm, she never complained about the cold, and her preparations seemed more and more sensible as the temperatures continued to drop. The first apology came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Betty, Margaret's most critical neighbor. Betty appeared at Margaret's house on a cold morning in late May, carrying a homemade cake and a visibly embarrassed air. "Margaret," she said, hesitating at the door. "May I come in?" Margaret invited her to sit in the warm living room. Betty looked around, noticing the organization and comfort of the place, so different from the biting cold she felt in her own home. "I came here to apologize to you," Betty finally said. "I said ugly things about you and it wasn't right." Margaret remained silent, allowing Betty to continue. "It's just that, well, a person my age sort of gets afraid of being alone too, you know. When I saw you acting so differently after Harold died, it kind of reminded me of my own fears." It was an honest and vulnerable explanation. Margaret felt her irritation subside. "Betty, I accept your apology, and I understand your fears. We're all afraid of loneliness." You really think the winter will be as terrible as they're saying?" Margaret nodded gravely. "Worse than anything we've ever lived through." "And what can I do? My house is poorly insulated and I don't have the strength to chop wood like you." Margaret studied Betty's worried face. Despite the past offenses, she saw sincerity and genuine remorse. "I can teach you some heating techniques that don't depend on a lot of wood," she said. "But first, I need to know if you're truly willing to change your attitude." "How so?" "Betty, if I help you, I need you to promise me 2 things. That you'll treat others with more respect from now on, and that you'll pass on what I teach you to those who need it." Betty nodded vigorously. "I promise. You've always been a good woman, Margaret. I was the fool." Margaret smiled for the first time in weeks. It was a start. In the hours that followed, Margaret taught Betty techniques she had learned from Harold over the years. How to position furniture to concentrate heat, how to use blankets and rugs strategically, how to prepare hot drinks that would warm the body for hours. "The secret," explained Margaret, "is to work with the heat you have, not waste it. Most people lose heat without realizing it." Betty absorbed every piece of information with the attention of a dedicated student. When she left Margaret's house that late afternoon, she was loaded with practical tips and a small bag of chopped wood. "Margaret," she said before leaving, "thank you so much. And can I tell other people about this?" "You can. But remember, only to those who are willing to apologize and change their attitude." The news that Margaret was helping Betty spread quickly. The next day, Susan appeared with a satisfied smile. "People are saying Mrs. Betty's house is much warmer now," she said, "and she's singing your praises." "It's a start," said Margaret modestly. "There are more people wanting to talk to you, respectfully." In the following days, a small procession of neighbors began to appear at Margaret's door. Each brought their apologies and their fears about the approaching winter. Robert from the bakery was one of the next. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, removing his cap, "I come here humbly to ask forgiveness for the things I said. It wasn't right to judge you that way." Margaret received him cordially but maintained her firm stance. "Robert, I accept your apology, but I need to know, why did you change your mind?" Because I'm seeing you were right about the cold, and because Betty told me about the techniques you taught her. Her house is wonderfully warm now." "And what do you want from me?" "Guidance. My bakery is spending a fortune on electricity to keep the place heated. If the winter really gets worse, I'll go bankrupt." Margaret considered the situation. Robert had a large family and employed 3 people from the village. His business was important to the community. "I can help you," she said, "but you'll have to implement changes in the bakery's structure. And you'll have to teach these techniques to your employees." Of course. Whatever it takes." Margaret spent the entire afternoon at the bakery, analyzing the airflow, identifying points of heat loss, and suggesting simple but effective modifications. Robert noted everything religiously. "The bakery's oven can be used more efficiently," explained Margaret. "Instead of turning it on just to bake bread, let it run longer and use the residual heat to warm the space." "I never thought of that," admitted Robert. "And these large windows are beautiful, but they're a disaster for heat retention. You need to install thick curtains or cover them with plastic during the coldest days." Margaret's suggestions were practical and based on solid knowledge. Robert implemented the changes immediately, and the results were impressive. In 3 days, his electricity bill was cut in half, even with the bakery maintaining a comfortable temperature. "It's a miracle," commented Jennifer, Robert's wife. "How does Mrs. Margaret know all these things?" 42 years living with a man who studied these things," replied Robert with admiration. "She learned by doing." The news of Betty and Robert's successes spread like wildfire. Suddenly, Margaret found herself sought after by half the village. Each person who came to her brought their sincere apologies and their pleas for help. Susan, observing everything closely, was impressed by the transformation. "You've become the most popular person in the village," she remarked during a visit. "Not popular," corrected Margaret. "Needed. It's different." "And how do you feel about that?" Margaret reflected on the question. Part of her felt satisfaction in seeing the same people who had humiliated her now recognizing her worth, but another part felt sadness for what she had to go through to get there. "I feel useful again," she finally said. "Like when I used to teach. It's good to know I can help people." But not everyone in the community was willing to swallow their pride. Derek, from the hardware store, watched the whole situation with growing irritation. "It's ridiculous," he complained to his wife. "Everyone running after that old woman as if she were a prophet." "Derek, she's helping people," retorted his wife, Sharon, "and from what I've heard, her tips really work." "They don't work at all. It's all coincidence. Winter has always been cold here." "Not like this," insisted Sharon, "and you know you were unfair to her. You refused to sell her tools just because she's a widow." Derek refused to admit he had been wrong. In his mind, giving in now would be admitting weakness. He maintained the stance that Margaret was just a hysterical woman who had gotten lucky with her predictions, but his stubbornness would have consequences. June arrived with a cold front that surprised even the official meteorologists. The temperature plummeted to 3 degrees below zero one morning, breaking all historical records for the region. Frost covered everything like a white blanket, and many plants that were still resisting the cold finally succumbed. The village woke up in shock. No one was prepared for temperatures so low so early in the winter. Heaters were working at their limit, electricity bills skyrocketed, and many families discovered their heating systems were inadequate, except for those Margaret had helped. The houses that had implemented her suggestions maintained comfortable temperatures with half the energy expenditure. Robert's Bakery became a warm refuge where people gathered for hot coffee and to escape the cold. "It's astonishing," murmured Dr. William to Susan. "Her techniques work better than any modern system I know." "Because they're based on decades of observation and experience," replied Susan. Harold really knew what he was doing. On that frigid morning, an even larger procession of neighbors appeared at Margaret's door. This time the apologies came with genuine desperation. "Mrs. Margaret," pleaded Daniel, who worked at the local post office, "my wife is 6 months pregnant. Our house is freezing, and I'm afraid it will harm the baby." Margaret felt a tightness in her chest. Health issues always touched her deeply. "Come in," she said immediately. "We'll fix this." Susan, who was visiting Margaret at that moment, offered to accompany the medical assessment of the situation. "Pregnant women need special care in the cold," she explained. "Low temperatures can affect circulation and cause problems for both mother and baby." Margaret took this very seriously. She spent the entire day at Daniel's house, implementing urgent modifications and teaching specific techniques to keep a pregnant woman warm and safe. "The couple's bedroom needs to be the warmest room in the house," she instructed, "and always keep hot water available for regular warm baths." Daniel and his wife, Rachel, followed every instruction religiously. Within 2 days, they had transformed their cold house into a warm and safe environment. "I don't know how to thank you," said Rachel, moved. "You saved our family." "Don't exaggerate," replied Margaret modestly. "I just passed on what I learned." But the truth was that Margaret was doing much more than sharing knowledge. She was rebuilding a community. Every family she helped became a multiplier of her techniques. People began to collaborate with each other, sharing resources and knowledge. Betty, who had been the first to apologize, became a kind of informal assistant to Margaret. She visited the families that had been helped, checked if they were implementing the techniques correctly, and brought questions back to Margaret. "You've created a mutual aid network," observed Dorothy during one of her visits. "People are coming together like I've never seen before." Margaret smiled. That was exactly what she hoped would happen. "Harold always said that strong communities can face any difficulty," she said. "They just need to learn to work together." But there was still resistance. Derek continued to refuse to seek out Margaret, even as his own home became increasingly uncomfortable. He had invested in expensive electric heaters, but the energy consumption was breaking his budget. "Derek, be sensible," pleaded Sharon one night, as the two huddled under several layers of blankets. "Everyone in the village is warm and spending half of what we are. It's just a matter of pride now." "I won't humiliate myself before that woman," Derek insisted. "She may have gotten lucky with some homemade techniques, but she's no expert." Sharon sighed, frustrated. She was 3 months pregnant and worried about the effects of the constant cold on her pregnancy. But she knew her husband well enough to know that insisting would only make him more stubborn. Derek's situation became even more complicated when his main heater supplier from the capital cancelled a delivery due to dangerous icy roads. His store was left without products just when demand was at its highest. "People are looking for heating alternatives," reported his employee, "but we have nothing in stock." Derek found himself losing sales to stores in neighboring towns that could maintain inventory. Meanwhile, Margaret's techniques continued to spread for free, reducing the dependence on electric heaters. Ironically, Margaret's success was hurting Derek's business. People were discovering they could heat themselves efficiently without buying expensive equipment. It was then that something happened that would change everything. On an especially cold night in late June, the village's electrical grid began to have problems. The excessive energy consumption for heating overloaded the system, causing intermittent power outages. that left some areas completely in the dark. Derek's house was one of the most affected. Without electricity, his expensive heaters became useless. The indoor temperature plummeted rapidly, and Sharon began to feel ill from the intense cold. "Derek, I'm not well," she said, shivering violently. "I need warmth." Derek tried everything he knew. He lit the fireplace fire, which smoked because it was poorly maintained, piled up blankets, closed all the windows. Nothing worked properly. The house remained freezing, and Sharon was clearly suffering. It was Sharon who made the final decision. "I'm going to Mrs. Margaret's house," she said, putting on the heaviest coat she had. "I won't risk our baby's health because of your pride." Derek watched her leave in the freezing dawn and felt the weight of responsibility. If anything happened to his wife and child because of his stubbornness, he would never forgive himself. 15 minutes later, he was knocking on Margaret's door. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, his voice choked, "is my wife here?" Margaret opened the door and saw Sharon sitting near the fireplace, finally looking comfortable for the first time in days. "She is," Margaret said calmly, "and she's safe." Derek looked around the warm house. Even without electricity, the place was cozy and warm. Margaret had created a system that worked independently of electrical power. How do you manage to keep everything heated without power?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Techniques I learned in 42 years of marriage to a wise man," Margaret replied. "Do you want to learn?" Derek hesitated. It was the moment of truth. He could keep his pride and go back home, leaving his pregnant wife at Margaret's house. Or he could swallow his pride and learn from the woman he had disrespected. "First of all," he said, removing his cap, "I need to apologize. I treated you horribly. I refused sales, spread malicious comments. It wasn't right." Margaret studied Derek's face. She saw sincerity in his eyes, but she also saw that he was still wrestling with his own pride. "Derek, I accept your apology, but I need to know, are you asking for help because you truly recognize you were wrong, or just because you're desperate?" The question hit Derek squarely. It was a question he had been asking himself. "Honestly," he said after a long silence, "a bit of both. I am desperate, yes, but I'm also starting to understand that I judged you completely wrong." It was an honest answer. Margaret appreciated the sincerity. "All right, I'll teach you, but with the same conditions I give everyone. You'll have to pass these techniques on and treat others with more respect from now on." "I accept," Derek said immediately. In that early morning, while Sharon slept peacefully on the warm sofa, Margaret taught Derek techniques that revolutionized his understanding of home heating. "The secret isn't to generate more heat," she explained. "It's to better conserve the heat you already have." She showed him how to position furniture to create heat zones, how to use common materials to insulate windows and doors, how to utilize kitchen heat to warm other rooms. "Do these techniques work even without electricity?" asked Derek, impressed. "Most of them, yes. That's why they're working so well for everyone. They don't depend on expensive technology or constant electrical power." Derek absorbed every detail attentively. For the first time, he was seeing Margaret not as an eccentric widow, but as an extraordinarily knowledgeable woman. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, when she finished her explanations, "may I ask a personal question?" "You may. Have you ever thought of turning this into a business? I mean, teaching these techniques professionally?" Margaret laughed softly. "Derek, I'm a retired teacher. My business has always been teaching. The difference is that now I'm teaching about survival instead of math. But it could be more than that. Like a training center, organized courses, you could help many more people." Margaret grew thoughtful. The idea hadn't occurred to her before, but it made sense. If Harold's predictions about the climate cycles were correct, other harsh winters would come in the future. "It's an interesting idea," she admitted, "but it would need structure, resources." "I have a store," Derek said quickly. "We could form a partnership, transform part of the store into a training center. You would teach the techniques, and I would provide the necessary materials." It was an unexpected proposal. Margaret studied Derek carefully. She could tell he was serious, but she also knew changes of that magnitude needed to be well thought out. "Let's see how you behave from now on," she said. "If you truly implement the changes you promised, we can talk about partnerships in the future." "Fair enough," agreed Derek. When the power came back the next day, Derek implemented Margaret's techniques in his home with immediate results. His electricity bill dropped drastically, and the environment became more comfortable than before. More importantly, he completely changed his attitude. At the store, he began asking about the customer's real needs instead of simply trying to sell expensive products. He offered advice based on the techniques Margaret had taught. "Derek is different," Sharon commented to Susan a few days later. "More humble, more considerate. I think this experience made him grow as a person." Susan smiled. That was exactly what Margaret hoped would happen with each person she helped. Not just solving practical problems, but promoting personal growth and greater empathy for others. July arrived with temperatures that definitively confirmed Harold's most dire predictions. Thermometers read 12 degrees below zero one morning, something never officially recorded in the region. The situation became so exceptional that journalists from the capital began visiting the village to report on the historic winter. It was during one of these visits that Margaret found herself being interviewed for the first time in her life. "Mrs. Margaret," asked the reporter, "how did you know this winter would be so harsh?" Margaret hesitated. It was the opportunity to finally give public credit to Harold's work. "My late husband was an amateur meteorologist," she said with pride. "He studied the weather patterns of this region for over 40 years and predicted exactly what is happening." "An amateur meteorologist? Can you tell us more about that?" Margaret told of the detailed notes, the precise charts, and the predictions based on decades of careful observation. The reporter was fascinated. "And did you learn these heating techniques from him?" "Some, yes. Others I developed over the years helping the community. The truth is that ordinary people can create very effective solutions when they understand the basic principles." The story aired on the state news that same night. For the first time, Harold Bennett was publicly recognized as the competent researcher he had always been, and Margaret was presented not as an eccentric woman, but as a wise educator who had turned scientific knowledge into practical solutions. The impact was immediate. People from other towns began calling the village asking for information about the heating techniques. Rural schools wanted to hire Margaret to give lectures. Agricultural organizations became interested in Harold's weather prediction methods. "You've become famous," Susan joked. "Harold became famous," corrected Margaret. "That's what he deserved for decades." But fame brought new challenges. Margaret found herself overwhelmed with requests for help from people she didn't even know. Phones rang constantly. Letters arrived in the mail. Visitors appeared at her door. It was Derek who proposed the solution. "Mrs. Margaret," he said during a visit, "you need help organizing all of this, and I remain interested in the partnership." Margaret considered the proposal more seriously this time. She truly was overwhelmed, and the demand for information was growing beyond her individual capacity to handle. "What exactly do you have in mind?" she asked. "To transform part of my store into a community education center," explained Derek. "You would give organized courses on heating techniques, preparation for weather emergencies, things like that. I would provide the space and materials, and we would split any profit there might be." "I'm not interested in profiting from this," said Margaret immediately. "Then we would use any money to expand the courses, help families in need, buy materials. The important thing is to better organize the help you're already giving." Margaret reflected on the proposal. Derek had really changed a lot since that night he showed up desperate at her door, and the idea of an organized center made sense. "I'll accept," she said finally. "But with clear conditions. The basic courses must always be free, especially for low-income families, and everything must be done based on respect and mutual collaboration." "Perfect," agreed Derek. "When do you want to start?" "Tomorrow," said Margaret with determination. The transformation of Derek's hardware store into a community education center happened with surprising speed. The back of the store was cleaned and reorganized to accommodate up to 20 people. Derek installed a small heating system for practical demonstrations and brought basic construction materials for exercises. Margaret prepared the first course with the care of an experienced teacher. She organized handmade handouts, prepared practical demonstrations, and even created an evaluation system to ensure the students really learned the techniques. "It seems you're back in the classroom," observed Susan, helping with the preparations. "Actually," said Margaret, smiling, "I never left, I just changed the subject." Margaret's first official course was offered on a Saturday morning, free of charge, to anyone interested. To everyone's surprise, not only did villagers show up, but people who had travelled miles from neighbouring towns to participate. "Good morning," said Margaret, looking at the 20 occupied chairs. "My name is Margaret Bennett. I'm a retired teacher, and I'm here to share knowledge that can save lives this winter." The course lasted 3 hours and covered everything from basic principles of heat conservation to advanced emergency heating techniques. Margaret taught, demonstrated, answered questions, and gave individual attention to each participant. "The most important thing you need to understand," she said during the conclusion, "is that preparation is not paranoia. It's responsibility to our family and to our community." The applause was warm and sincere. Several people stayed after the course to ask specific questions and exchange contacts with other participants. A network of collaboration was forming naturally. "Mrs. Margaret," said a lady who had come from the neighbouring town, "when will the next course be?" "Next Saturday," replied Margaret, "and it will always be free." Derek watched everything with growing admiration. Margaret had a natural gift for teaching and inspiring people. More than that, she could transform technical information into practical knowledge that really changed lives. In the following weeks, Margaret's courses became anticipated events in the region. Every Saturday, more people showed up. Some came from towns over 100 miles away. Derek's small store became the center of a rapidly growing educational community. But it was in August that something happened that would test everything Margaret had taught. A hailstorm followed by icy winds of over 60 miles per hour hit the region in the early morning. Roofs were damaged, windows shattered, and many houses completely lost their ability to retain heat inside. The temperature plummeted to 3 degrees below zero, an absolute record that confirmed Harold's most extreme predictions. "This is a real emergency," Dr. Williams said to Susan at the health clinic. "We have entire families at risk of hypothermia." But the families that had participated in Margaret's courses reacted in a completely different way. They immediately implemented emergency protocols that Margaret had taught, created temporary shelters within their own homes, and organized mutual support systems. Margaret's house naturally became the coordination center for the emergency response. People showed up there asking for guidance, offering help, and reporting risky situations. "Mrs. Margaret," said Daniel from the post office, arriving breathless. "Mr. John's family is in trouble. Their house roof partially collapsed, and they have no way to heat it." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Derek," she said, "get emergency materials from the store. Susan, come with me to assess the medical situation. Betty, organize a group to prepare hot food." Within minutes, a rescue operation was organized. Margaret had become, without realizing it, the community's natural leader in times of crisis. At John's house, Margaret found a family of 5, including 2 small children, shivering in a partially protected room. The situation was truly serious. "Susan, how are the children?" asked Margaret while assessing the structural damage. "Early stages of hypothermia," Susan replied after examining everyone. "We need to warm them up quickly." Margaret immediately implemented an emergency protocol she had developed for extreme situations. Within 2 hours, the family was sheltered in an insulated area of the house, with controlled temperature and an emergency heating system working. "How do you know how to do this?" asked John, impressed with the operation's efficiency. 42 years living with a man who prepared for situations like this," answered Margaret. "And 2 years teaching people to prepare too." The rescue operation for John became a model that was replicated for other families affected by the storm. Within 48 hours, all emergencies were resolved, with no loss of life or serious cases of hypothermia. "It's impressive," Dr. Williams said to Margaret after the crisis had passed. "Without the preparation you promoted, we would have had serious tragedies." "It was the work of the whole community," Margaret said modestly. "I only taught the techniques. It was the people who implemented them." But the truth was that Margaret had created something bigger than survival techniques. She had created a resilient community, capable of facing adversity through collaboration and proper preparation. The news of the village's exceptional response to the storm reached the capital. Journalists returned to document how a small rural community had managed to face extreme weather conditions without recording a single casualty. The secret was preparation and unity, Margaret explained to a television crew. When people know what to do and work together, they can overcome any difficulty. The interview was seen by thousands of people across the state. Margaret received invitations to give lectures at universities, consult with civil defense organizations, and even advise the state government on preparing for climate emergencies. "You've become a recognized expert," said Susan, showing the newspapers that talked about Margaret. "I'm not an expert," replied Margaret. "I'm just a teacher who learned to listen to nature and teach what I learned. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just getting started." Now, continuing that September brought a gradual improvement in temperatures, but it also brought new responsibilities for Margaret. The community education center she and Derek had created was receiving visitors from across the state. Universities wanted to study her techniques. International organizations inquired about replicating her methods in other regions. "Mrs. Margaret," said Derek one afternoon, "we've received an official invitation from the state government. They want to create a climate emergency preparedness program based on our model." Margaret read the official document carefully. It was an opportunity to vastly expand the impact of her work, but it also represented changes she wasn't sure she wanted. "Would this mean leaving the village?" she asked. "Not necessarily. It could be a decentralized program, with the base continuing here and expansions to other regions." Margaret thought about Harold and what he would say about this opportunity. She imagined he would be proud to see his knowledge being used to help people across the state. "I'll accept," she said. "But on one condition. The program must always maintain a focus on community education and local collaboration. I don't want it to become a bureaucratic thing, distant from the people." "They assured us the model would be preserved," said Derek, "and you would have full control over the teaching methods." And so, at 66, Margaret found herself beginning a new career as the state coordinator for community climate emergency preparedness. But she never lost focus on her hometown. Every Saturday, she continued giving free courses at the center she had created with Derek. Every month, she organized meetings to update emergency protocols based on the climate observations she continued making using Harold's techniques. Susan became her official assistant, helping with the medical coordination of the emergency programs. Derek expanded the store to include a full section dedicated to climate emergency preparedness materials. Betty, the once critical neighbor, became one of the most dedicated volunteer instructors, teaching basic techniques to other seniors. "Who would have thought," commented Dorothy during a visit, "that you'd become the most important person in the region by stacking firewood?" Margaret smiled, looking out the window at the stacks of firewood she still kept organized around the house. They were no longer needed for heating. The winter was losing its bite. But she kept them as a reminder of where it all began. "It wasn't by stacking firewood that I became important," she said. "It was by honoring the memory of a wise man and turning knowledge into community action." The state program coordinated by Margaret became a model for other regions of the country. Her techniques were adapted for different types of climate emergencies: droughts, floods, heat waves. The small community education center in St. Benedict Heights became a study destination for researchers from across the United States. But for Margaret, the greatest satisfaction remained Saturday mornings, when she saw familiar and new faces gathering to learn, share, and prepare together. It was there that she felt she was truly honoring Harold's legacy and her own calling as an educator. "Harold would be proud," she murmured one morning, adjusting her brown shawl before beginning another course. "His knowledge is saving lives and bringing people together." 2 years later, when journalists returned to make a documentary about the transformation of the village, they found a completely different community. The same houses, the same streets, but people who had learned the value of preparation, collaboration, and mutual respect. "Mrs. Margaret," asked the documentarian. "What was the most important change you observed in this community?" Margaret thought carefully about her answer. The most important change was learning that individual strength is limited, but collective strength is infinite. When we understood that preparation is a shared responsibility, we became capable of facing any adversity. And the people who criticized you at the beginning, how do they feel now? Margaret looked around the room of the community center, where several of those people were sitting as dedicated students. They learned the same lesson I learned long ago. Judging by appearances is a mistake that can cost dearly. Now we are all companions in the mission of caring for each other. The documentary, when aired nationally, inspired hundreds of other communities to develop their own community preparedness programs. Margaret received invitations to travel across the country, sharing her experiences, but she preferred to remain based in her hometown. "My place is here," she explained to Susan. "This is where Harold made his observations, where I learned my lessons, where I can be most useful." Derek, in turn, became a completely transformed businessman. His store evolved into a community cooperative that reinvested profits into educational and emergency preparedness projects. He often told visitors how Margaret had changed not only his life, but his understanding of what it meant to be part of a community. "She taught me that true success is not how much you earn, but how much you contribute," he would say. "And that humility is strength, not weakness." Sharon, Derek's wife, gave birth to a healthy daughter during the harshest winter. The girl, whom they named Hope in honor of the hope Margaret brought to the community, grew up in an environment where preparation, collaboration, and respect for others were fundamental values. "She will grow up in a better community than the one we grew up in," Sharon said to Margaret during one of the girl's birthdays, "and that is thanks to you." Margaret always deflected such praise, but secretly felt deeply satisfied. She had managed to transform not only survival techniques, but fundamental human values. 3 years after the historic winter, Margaret received a letter that moved her deeply. It was from a group of meteorologists at the State University who had studied Harold's notes and wanted to formalize recognition of his scientific work. "Dear Mrs. Margaret," she read aloud to Susan, "after detailed analysis of your late husband's meteorological observations, we conclude that he developed climate prediction methods of exceptional precision for a self-taught researcher. We would like to name a weather station in his honor and include his methods in our undergraduate course." Margaret cried as she read the letter. Finally, Harold was receiving the scientific recognition he had always deserved. "He would be so happy," she murmured, holding the letter to her chest. The inauguration ceremony for the Harold Bennett Weather Station took place on a sunny spring day, with representatives from the university, the state government, and, most importantly for Margaret, with the entire community of St. Benedict Heights present. "Harold Bennett," said the university president during his speech, "represents the best of American citizen science. Your dedication to scientific observation and your accuracy in predictions prove that genuine knowledge can emerge anywhere, from anyone willing to observe, learn, and persist." Margaret stood when called to speak. Looking at the audience, she saw faces that represented her complete journey, neighbors who had criticized her and later apologized, people she had helped prepare, young people who now studied techniques developed by her husband. "Harold always said that nature teaches those who are willing to listen," she said. "Today, seeing all of you here, I see he was right about that too. When we listen to nature and to each other, we create knowledge that can change the world." The applause was long and warm, but for Margaret, the most special moment was when Dorothy approached after the ceremony. "Margaret," said her friend of decades, "you managed to give Harold the recognition he always deserved, and you managed to turn our community into a real family." "We managed," corrected Margaret. "Every person who opened themselves to learn, every person who chose to collaborate instead of compete, it was everyone's work." That night, Margaret sat on her porch, wearing the same brown shawl she had worn through all the difficult times. She looked at the house that remained surrounded by neatly stacked firewood, now more out of tradition and symbolism than practical necessity. Susan appeared with 2 cups of hot tea, as had become the habit on special nights. "Mrs. Margaret," she said, sitting beside her friend, "may I ask a question I've always wanted to ask?" "Of course." "Did you really know all this was going to happen? This whole transformation of the community?" Margaret thought carefully about the question. "I knew the winter was going to be harsh because I trusted Harold's knowledge. I knew people were going to need help, because they always do. But I didn't know it would turn into all this." She gestured toward the village. "That's what happens when good people decide to work together." "And are you happy with how it all ended?" Margaret smiled, looking at the stars Harold used to observe with his improvised telescope. "I am at peace," she said. "His knowledge is being used to help people. Our community learned to take care of each other, and I discovered it's never too late to start a new phase of life." Susan nodded, understanding the feeling perfectly. "Will you keep giving the Saturday courses?" "As long as there are people wanting to learn and I have the strength to teach," replied Margaret with determination. "This work never ends. Every new person who learns can teach others, and so the knowledge keeps growing." "And the plans for the national expansion of the program?" "They will happen," said Margaret, "but always keeping the focus on community education. What we learned here can be adapted to any place, any situation. The important thing is to keep the principles: responsible preparation, genuine collaboration, and mutual respect." The two friends sat in comfortable silence for a while, contemplating the tranquility of the village that had become a symbol of community resilience. "You know something, Susan," Margaret said eventually. "When I started stacking firewood, people thought I was going crazy with grief. In truth, I was following the last advice of a wise man. Sometimes what looks like madness to others is wisdom they can't yet see. And sometimes," added Susan, "what looks like an end is just the beginning of something much greater." Margaret nodded, adjusting the shawl over her shoulders. Tomorrow would be another Saturday course, another opportunity to share knowledge and strengthen community bonds. The firewood around the house would remain there as a symbol of preparation and perseverance, and the memory of Harold would live on through each person who learned to heed the signs of nature and prepare properly to face them. "Good evening, Susan," said Margaret, standing up. "You have class early tomorrow." "Good evening, Mrs. Margaret, and thank you for everything you've done for all of us." Margaret entered the house smiling. At 66, she had discovered that the most significant phase of her life was just beginning. The harsh winter that had tested the community was over, but the lessons learned and the transformations achieved would last forever. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave it in the comments with sincere words. Do you believe Margaret made the right decisions? We love reading your opinion. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories.